Today, my guest is Avrum Laurie from Wealthsimple. Before Wealthsimple, Avrum held leadership roles at Freshbooks and started his product career at Microsoft. Thanks for joining me today, Avrum.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. So, as a Canadian iconic startup, there are some exciting things you're doing over there at Wealthsimple. Wealthsimple Trade recently became the first broker in North America to offer fractional share purchases. What was that like for you and the team to work on such an exciting project?
I don't think we're the first in North America, but we're definitely the first in Canada. Fractional shares do exist in some of US brokerages already, but excited to be the first in Canada. Yeah, I think fractional shares is actually a feature that's really aligned with our mission of democratizing finance. You know, sometimes buying a single stock of Amazon or of Tesla, is actually cost prohibitive. And fractional shares basically allows others to participate, in the potential upside of those companies and invest in the companies they love and that they use and that they want to support, but with a minimal investment that ultimately aligns with how much they're prepared to risk, how much they can afford. And so it was a pretty exciting launch. I mean, I can tell you, I use it because I'm way too cheap to buy full shares of Tesla, but I want to be part of the journey. I want to be part of the ride. So yeah, it was a really exciting launch.
One of the exciting things that I've noticed as part of those new product offerings is you guys seem to continuously deliver exciting new things to customers and a few things that are also in beta. It seems like you guys have a really strong product sense for what your customers need. And having been a customer for some time across many of your products, how do you guys think about product sense, which is our theme for the year, or excuse me, our theme for the season? Can you explain about how you guys think about product sense and synthetic thinking?
It's interesting because, if I contrast my experience at Wealthsimple with the experience of FreshBooks, FreshBooks is basically accounting and billing for small service-based business owners. I've never run a small service-based business. And so, my intimacy with that problem and that sort of lived experience was always a bit once removed, right? Obviously, we did tons of research and tons of customer research and customer interviews to really deeply understand that customer profile. But there was at least for me, I was always sort of not able to be fully intimate with it because I haven't worked in that context. It's interesting to contrast that with Wealthsimple because Wealthsimple, I use all the products too, as just a regular client like anyone else. And I think that gives me, it's like a little bit of a cheat code when it comes to product management that I've learned is if you actually use the products regularly, you have an ability you have an intimacy that is hard to replicate and a familiarity and and an empathy for the customer that is stronger. Now I will caveat that really heavily though, because I think the one danger is that you start to confuse yourself as being like the target client. And I'm certainly not that. And recognize the incredibly privileged position that I'm in, and that a lot of Wealthsimple customers are in, and we're not the be all and the end all when it comes to the customer. That said, again, it allows us that level of familiarity of being a customer of your own product, just provides a deeper level of insight, and again, a more sort of intimate baseline for which you can interact with your customers, which I really think is amazing. That said, using your own product is by no means a substitute for talking to customers, for real customer research, and making sure that you're talking to a really diverse set of customers so that you're ultimately getting a real mix of experience of people who have different lives, different needs, and ultimately figuring out, where to focus. So yeah, anything I could elaborate on there?
There's a term that you like to use called synthetic thinking. And
right.
I was wondering, what does that mean to you?
For sure. Yeah, I think especially product managers who are early in their career often think that the role of the product manager is to be kind of like the idea person who like sits at their desk and like pontificates about the future and like comes up with these brilliant creative product ideas. And you quickly realize that is not your job. Your job as a product manager, and that doesn't mean it doesn't take a sharp mind to be a product manager, but rather I think that the real challenge and where the real genius of some of the best product managers I've ever worked with shines through is this ability to synthesize from a myriad of different inputs. Structured inputs, structured data, unstructured data, customer interviews, market data, business cases, app store reviews. This large corpus of basically infinite corpus of available data at your disposal, and synthesize that into a point of view.
Mm.
And that synthesis is what I refer to as synthetic thinking. And that is incredibly difficult and is far more difficult in my experience than sitting at your desk and pontificating about, the future of the world and what great ideas you have. Because it basically means like recognizing patterns in, again, these overwhelming data sets, and then synthesizing those patterns into a point of view for your product strategy that you can then pursue. And I just think that's, when you see it done well, it's incredibly impressive. But it also takes a lot of practice to get good at, because anything that requires pattern recognition takes many kicks of the can in order to be good at it, to start recognizing the common themes and patterns. And so it's also something that is a sort of a lifelong journey for a product manager, this kind of synthetic thinking, knowing how to really filter out the noise and extract as much signal as possible from the data that is available to you.
I think that's a wonderful term. And I can suspect a lot of people listening right now are thinking, so how, maybe they know how to do it. How do they teach their team? Like, what kind of tools, cognitive or otherwise, and structures could they provide to help them, make sure that thinking and then the subsequent communication of that can be delivered so that people can go, I understand what you're looping together, and that story ties really well. Go off and do those things you want to do now. How do you help and coach PMs to get stronger at that?
Right. Yeah, it is something that takes a lot of practice. I would say a couple of things. One is something that I never deviate from when I employ synthetic thinking and when I coach others on employing synthetic thinking is, employing a rigorous scientific methodology. That is something you never innovate on because it's been around for thousands of years. I'm not actually sure when the scientific method was established, but let's assume thousands of years. And it's very well refined. It's very well defined. And that's not, and so, stand on the shoulders of giants and adopt, the thing that works. So from a methodological perspective, I think fundamentally you need to perceive in a rigorous fashion. So what that means, from this large corpus of data that you have, you synthesize a hypothesis, and that hypothesis needs to be falsifiable. It needs to be, an educated assumption about, either how things work or how things could work. And it's falsifiable insofar as you have to be able to prove or disprove it using an experiment or, some version of an experiment. So that's the first thing, and that never changes. And following a rigorous scientific, structure, at least ensures that you're following, a systematic process of problem solving that, is well defined. The second piece, though, that I think is actually really important as well is how you communicate that hypothesis and that approach in a way that is persuasive, compelling, and really tells a clear narrative. That is really challenging, and that's where maybe the scientific method is an incomplete process and has to be coupled with, some of the communication practices and storytelling practices that product managers, are often really good at. Which is to say, like, you're not trying to ultimately articulate this sort of dry, very scientific, objective hypothesis. You're trying to tell a story of a customer problem, informed by all the data and insight that you have, that ultimately informs a point of view. And I think that getting really good at telling that story and really, letting others sort of engage in it in a deep and meaningful way is hard, but it ultimately is like really worthwhile because it gets everyone to buy in to sort of the approach that you've set out. And so storytelling is another piece of the puzzle that I think is crucially important for product managers.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. The understanding the scientific method and applying it, especially when you're rolling out such large changes or even a small change that could impact a large number of users. How do you, if maybe you're talking to a startup founder who's trying to build a new product and it's a lot of 0 to 1 work and also new products that are being introduced at Wealthsimple all the time, can they still apply that level of thinking? And, is there an example in your mind that was really strikingly awesome that someone did in terms of using that methodology to make a change to the product that maybe a lot of people didn't buy into early on?
Yeah, I mean, to start, to answer your first question, I actually think it's even more critically important in a 0 to 1 context that you're following this rigorous scientific approach, because that is, you know, I'm assuming this is pre-product market fit. This is early days. This is before you've actually figured out what your product, what your value is. But hopefully you have a hypothesis of what it is. And I think being scientific means that you're open to the idea that you're wrong, and that, you stop, at a certain point, if you are not, succeeding, you actually have the opportunity to pivot, try something else, informed by what you've seen in market, and that you don't sort of keep running at the same wall over and over again and expecting different results. So I actually think it's it's probably most important in a 0 to 1 context, because in an early stage context, because you only have so much runway. And so, you need to be really scientific and, rigorous and objective about how you're evaluating your success and your successes and your failures, and not getting precious about an idea or approach, and ultimately letting the sort of the data from your in-market experience dictate, ultimately what you do next. So that would be maybe my first answer to the first part of that question. I would say that the one caveat I'd add is that scientific method doesn't mean overly bureaucratic or overly process driven. It just means being actually really rigorous and systematic, and that means the minimum amount of process in order to preserve that rigor is what you need. Because I also think that the most important thing for an early stage company to do is ship, and ship a lot. And so getting bogged down in too much cumbersome, unhelpful process is not necessarily going to help you. But I don't think that that's necessarily that's necessarily true at all when I say scientific method. I really mean distilling it down to the raw, bare essentials of process in order to be objective and scientific. In terms of an example that I could think of, I mean, I might actually just use Wealthsimple Trade itself as the product Wealthsimple Trade, which is our self-directed trading product, as an example in and of itself of an example of kind of this in action. So, for those who may not know, Wealthsimple is, we started out as a way to do automated investing. Some people use the term robo-advisor. We don't like that term because it sounds very robotic and inhuman, and we're trying to be a human financial institution. In fact, the most human financial institution. But that's where we started out. It's, automated passive investing. But kind of what we realized is that, there was we believed a gap in the market for, a simple, client-friendly, self-directed, investment platform. There just wasn't one in Canada that was really serving the needs of, especially new investors, but even established investors, just didn't have that much, didn't really have that much, in the way of product offerings, especially when you contrast with, the other, markets like the US. And so what we realized is that, by virtue of the fact that we had built this, automated investing platform, Wealthsimple Invest, the robo, we actually had a brokerage. So we actually had all the, we had the back-end services and the infrastructure and the platform that would allow us to build a self-directed experience without, a tremendous amount of additional work. And so we could actually leverage, again, the asset that we already had, which was, again, the sort of the brokerage back-end, and build a really super lean product layer on top of it. And when I say super lean, the beginnings of Wealthsimple Trade were, you could only open a single account type, and only one of those, a non-registered account. There was admittedly limited stocks even available on the platform, but the fact that we were able to leverage our existing, brokerage infrastructure and platform and relatively quickly add basically a product layer on top of it allowed us to validate that there was indeed this gap in the Canadian market, and that customers were interested in something simpler, something lower cost, something that ultimately solves the problem of self-directed investing in a modern way. And that was our hypothesis, that this product would have a market and have interest. And it was validated fairly quickly. Like right out of the gate, we had massive interest in terms of a wait list that was hundreds of thousands of customers long. And over the since its launch a couple of years ago, the customer base has grown by leaps and bounds. And I think the nice thing is that we didn't have to invest that much in the early days in order to quickly validate that there was a business here, that there was a real opportunity here. So I think that's a great example of the scientific method in action. And if it hadn't been successful, if it hadn't worked, again, we had built a layer on top of our existing brokerage. So it didn't jeopardize our existing incumbent business. It was built separately in a sort of a decoupled way.
I've got to ask. You mentioned that there was a waiting list that was in the tens of thousands, if not the hundreds of thousands. Would you, if you were to think back to when the product had hit that MVP, and I actually do remember using it at that early stage, would another experiment could have been to maybe just do the screenshots and tease people like this is coming out in a few months? Do you think that there was maybe even a smaller version of that available in terms of testing against the scientific method? Or do you guys sort of have a belief that you've got to put the product in the user's hands to truly validate if you're going to go forward?
Yeah, I think more so the latter. I would say like waitlists are a great tool, but they ultimately have their limits in terms of what they can demonstrate. And I think one of the key challenges with a waitlist, or sometimes people call it this like a painted door test, which is like it's everything smoke and mirrors, and you basically set up a website. You haven't actually written a line of code other than the website in order to validate this. Is that you can get some perhaps early validation that people are interested in this concept or idea. The problem is, unless there's actually a product and actually a meaningful value exchange between the customer or the potential customer and your business, the validation is only so useful. It's kind of skin deep, because it's like if you ask the person what features they want, people will just keep saying yes to every feature in the world. But if they have to pay for that feature, i.e., if there has to be a value exchange between giving up something in order to secure that feature, then suddenly they become a lot more selective about what they want, and that suddenly they have to prioritize because you've inserted a constraint, which is, well, you're going to have to give something up, and that isn't always money. It could be your time, your investment. It could be like the switching cost of moving from an existing player to you. But there has to be a value exchange in order for that validation to be really meaningful and to really start to demonstrate product market fit. And again, waitlists are great and they're a great tool in the arsenal, but they often don't imply enough of value exchange such that you can really be super confident in the results. I mean, it's a great vote of confidence, no doubt, 100%. But you need enough of a product where people are exchanging value at scale, and then you can basically say, okay, yes, I'm on the right track. And the other thing I'd say about waitlists is, because I think I've misused them and used them correctly in my career. If you build this grand vision on a landing page and people are super excited, and then you go dark for N months as you build the product, you can actually burn some credibility and some trust with those customers, because you showed them a glimpse of something that wasn't really necessarily even close to being ready, and that excitement kind of fizzles in a way that is ultimately not helpful to your business, and you erode a bit of trust. So that's the other thing, is that like you want to be if you're leveraging like a waitlist in that context, you want to be close enough to the actual realization of that product that it doesn't feel like you're misleading your customers, even though obviously that's never your intention, but it can certainly feel that way if there's a big gap.
I really like that. When you were thinking about your own development of these types of intuitions or product sense, and I think what you've aptly called synthetic thinking. When you look back at your career, were there moments or, a particular project where you felt like it was going up from that early stage trying to piece this together, where you really started to understand how to connect the dots? And what what changed? What did you learn in those moments to be kind of really improve your product thinking?
I mean, I think I went through a somewhat of a typical product journey that a lot of product managers go through, where, came out of university thinking I was, again, supposed to be this idea person. And I think, one of the things that is humbling for every product manager is, for a few years, you play a little bit of that role early in your career, and you ship things that you think are great and that nobody uses and that people don't adopt, and don't have the impact on the business that you assume that they would. And so there's a very real sort of humbling experience of realizing that, like, there's got to be a better way, because the way I'm doing it is not achieving the results or impact that I actually ultimately want. So I think there is an unavoidable, I guess, amount of product failure that you need to go through, where you learn lessons the hard way. Now, you want to make sure that, like, you're not, like, putting a business in existential jeopardy to learn some lessons as a product manager, but, like, that generally does not happen. And that was actually one of the great benefits of joining a company like Microsoft, is that, like, as much as they would, it was bureaucratic enough that there was no danger that a junior PM was going to torpedo the various businesses that I worked on. But there is kind of no substitute of going through those painful experiences. And I mean, there's those experiences are humbling in two different ways. One is the way that I said, is that the project, or the thing you deliver ultimately does not have the intended impact. In fact, it has a null result. It doesn't achieve anything, and that sucks. What's worse is when it has the opposite of its intended impact, or it causes it actually causes degradation of the user experience in some unintended, unanticipated way. And that's even more painful, but it's perhaps also more impactful to you as a product practitioner, because you never want to feel that ever again. To try to ship something that you believe has value to the world and have it be just thrown right back at you and saying, no thanks, this is terrible. There is no more humbling experience for a product manager, but it's also probably, there's no more elemental experience for a product manager to learn that, like, well, maybe there's a better way of doing this.
That's a great point, and it's impressive because those leave such a mark on PMs in their journey. They can't forget those things, and they generally, I wouldn't want to use the word scarred, but they don't forget them. And I actually noticed, this might dovetail into another question I had for you, is some of the language you actually use internally to make sure that, even though there could be high conviction around a certain direction or a hypothesis, I notice you don't use the words product approval. You use the words peer review and peer feedback. Can you talk a little bit about why that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think specifically the word approval, implies a power dynamic where there is an approver and then there is a person submitting things for approval and trying to secure approvals. But that implies this sort of power dynamic. And I think that power dynamic become very toxic. And it is, that kind of power dynamic is also like the enemy of the scientific method, because it implies that objective facts and objective truths matter less than seniority and title, and who has the role of approver, and who has who is the person trying to secure the approval. And so I've really tried to get away from the concepts of approvals and rather move towards a culture of critique, of rigorous feedback and rigorous debate, but one where level and title is not the highest order bit when it comes to the importance of the feedback being received. Rather, the quality of the feedback is the higher order bit when it comes to the importance of that feedback. Now, just to be clear, just so I don't come across like totally tone deaf, I also recognize that it's easy for me to say as a senior leader and as an executive at the company, but I guess it is something that I try to be self-aware about. And, and to create a culture where ultimately I'm empowering the people who work on my team to ultimately own and make the decision about what they do with the feedback they receive. Because I would say paradoxically, if you give someone feedback and you say, oh, by the way, you must implement my feedback, generally they don't take your feedback. Like maybe they'll grudgingly implement your feedback, but they don't seriously consider, because it just seems so tops down and sort of dictatorial, and so they don't critically evaluate the content of that feedback. However, if you pivot that feedback and say, here's my strong feedback, I strongly disagree with this approach because of X, Y, Z. I leave it to you to make the decision, though. Well, guess what? They seriously consider that your feedback in a much more careful way, and maybe they ultimately decide to go down the original path that they had taken, but they own that, and they were ultimately accountable for the results of that decision. But it actually causes them to much more seriously consider and examine your feedback if you ultimately empower them to actually own the decision. And I think that starts with creating a culture that is not about approvals and sign-offs, and one about critique, vigorous debate, and feedback. All sorts of weird dynamics emerge when you focus on approvals. People start gaming approvals, where they design something, an experience or an approach that they know you'll like, as opposed to one that's like actually right for the business or the customer. And that's awful, especially when you realize it's happening and you're like, oh no, it's sort of a kind of a pandering, but it's a kind of pandering you create as a leader because you created an environment that is all about approvals. Or people design for the approval as opposed to, I guess that's a similar statement, but people design for the approval as opposed to what's right for the business, the customer, which is just not where you want to end up.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's such a strong piece of advice for product leaders out there that are working with the team and may have that language within their process. Conversely, towards people that are coming into their product career, maybe they're in their first few years and they're listening to this and thinking, okay, so I'm right now doing a lot of product ownership and I've not been yet given the keys to maybe take on, or maybe I have just been given the keys, to take on a bigger project. But now I've got to really synthesize both product data, qualitative inputs. What would be a couple of pieces of feedback or advice, I should say, that you would give them to help them sort of strengthen that muscle so that they make better decisions around serving their customer?
Something that I sort of advise everyone, my entire team, it's like the analogy of shipping quickly, but for a product manager, because product managers don't ultimately like ship actual code. We ship work for other people to do. But in the spirit of shipping early and often, what I think is really important for a product manager to do is put out a straw dog, quickly for early feedback and critique, which is like, don't focus, which means reorienting your objective, which is like your objective is to solicit early feedback on, high level, sort of more existential approach and existential questions than it is to be right. If your goal is to be right, then you will polish and perfect and wait till you have the perfect strategic framework, or at least in your mind, and that's bulletproof and you have every rebuttal considered. But actually, it is far more valuable to put something out that is maybe not fully defined and but which is a little bit rougher, still rigorous, still logical, but ultimately like a point of view that people can react to and comment on. That's such a powerful tool, both to build alignment, but also to farm for dissent, and also to give people the agency to feel like they can actually express that dissent, because they're not dealing with a final deliverable or something that's fully baked where they have to really feel like they're raining on your parade at this point to express their dissent. It makes it safer, easier. It feels like lowers the stakes a little bit, but it gives people the ability to put their hands up and say, yes, I'm in. This is exactly where we want to go. Or conversely, to say, like, I fundamentally disagree with the approach that we're taking. here's my point of view, and here's where we may be, and to talk through that misalignment. So that would be certainly be something that I would really encourage PMs to do, especially in that early context. But to be clear, that also means being courageous enough to take an opinion quickly, and that can be daunting because I think a lot of PMs can say, but I'm going to lose face. They're going to not respect me. They're going to think I'm playing it fast and loose as opposed to being the thorough, comprehensive PM that they expect. And I guess I would say that that can be solved by setting the appropriate context with the people that you're working with. That that's not you're not trying to be right. You're trying to basically ship something to the world and see how the market, which is in this case your engineering, design, whomever, executive counterparts react to that idea, to that point of view, to that perspective. I think that's super important.
That's great. Do you notice that over time that maybe more senior PMs who may not want to take an incremental approach but feel highly convicted over shipping something much larger and taking longer periods of time is sort of their weakness in terms of product sense because they have built up so much more knowledge and information that they're willing to take larger bets over time? And how has that played out if you've seen it? Maybe it's my own observation, but I see senior or PMs that are much more experienced that go, I can go through all this data and stuff, but I know we're going to make a larger size bet. So in that context, it was I need a smaller PM to take little risks and little feedback. Some PMs are I'm just going to ship this thing. It's going to take 6 months and I'm going to go ghost for a bit. I'll get some feedback along the way from senior people, but I know that this is a bigger piece. So I guess my question was sort of around when you see more experienced PMs try to take on more longer term projects that don't maybe have as much validation, but higher conviction, how do you orient them?
Right. I guess what I'd say is that certainly as you progress in your career, you are both entrusted with, bigger strategic, imperatives or, whatever pillars or whatever for your company, bigger strategic, more ambitious strategic objectives. And you also get more comfortable, dealing with them because you've been around the block a couple times. So you have a certain amount of pattern recognition to be able to take on problems of a larger scope and magnitude. What I would say though is, no matter how senior you are, especially when you're taking on, a larger initiative, you both want to have a well-defined sense of where you're going, which is the vision, the ultimate direction of where you're going. And you want that to be well articulated. You want that to be inspiring, ambitious, and really well-defined. And then you want to know your first step to get there. And I would argue that even for big, hairy, audacious goals, there is still a first step. And that still needs to be well defined. I would argue you need the vision defined first so that you know that you're taking steps in that direction. But I guess what I'm saying here is I don't see incrementalism and not moonshots, but step change work to be at odds. I don't think that they are, kind of mutually exclusive kinds of work. I think incrementalism is actually is one of the paths you take to get to that step change and to de-risk it along the way. But that doesn't mean you don't need that visionary objective target that you're ultimately shooting for. Because, two things are going to happen. One is, you can take these incremental steps along the way really to bring value forward and to learn and, accelerate learning and actually validate that this vision is actually correct. And there's a great feedback loop there because if the vision isn't perfect, which is unlikely to be, you can also tweak the vision as you go, as you're learning. And so, you're both tweaking your path to get there, but also tweaking the destination a little bit. And ultimately, by the end of it, once you've arrived at your vision, the sort of the promised land, it's probably changed and evolved from its original conception. But it's done that by virtue of what you've learned along the way. So I think that they're very complementary, actually.
I love that point of view. Product process can be an evolution and can be something really critical to the success of a team and can be, 1 + 1 = 3 in many contexts. What are some of the challenges you've seen with product process, and how have you evolved them to work more beneficially for your team?
Yeah, I have certainly observed, process run amok where process becomes bureaucracy. And for me, I would define, the red flags of that happening is when basically people are seen to be going through the motions of the process without critically examining whether that process is worthwhile. So it's like product management on autopilot. It's like you're going through the mechanics of product management without critically thinking about, whether something is worth doing and what the value, of that sort of ritual or that process is really to the ultimate end goal, which is to have an impact on the customer and the business. And like a simple example would be like like, okay, it's like an overly prescriptive product process would be like every process must start with general, and then every sort of feature we build needs to be user tested with users before we start building the user experience. And every feature we deliver must be split tested as an A/B test. To me, if you have edicts like those, your team is probably shut off their brain and is not critically examining why they are doing those things and whether there's value in doing those things. And really, even if there is, because many times the answer is yes, are they even extracting the value out of those things, or are they running through a checklist?
Mm.
And I've seen that happen, and I think it becomes, it becomes disengaging for the folks who are working in a context like that, and you're not necessarily being as efficient as you could be as well, because you're doing things by the book as opposed to you're following a rule book instead of following a playbook. To say it another way. And so the way I sort of characterize effective process is a set of tools and a set of structure. And like any good tool, there's a time and a place for it, but you have to critically think, is this appropriate? Is this apt? Is this going to benefit me? And in this context? And if so, why? And it's going to force you to think about it as, a set of tools, at your disposal, which you can choose to deploy or not. And you can be judicious about it. And so, you're not, running around with a hammer and therefore everything's looking like a nail. You're critically considering on a case by case basis, what is required and what is important. And then when I say structure, I mean, I think that there are some universal structures to how we decompose, and approach problems that we should always employ. And I think I alluded to this in an earlier question, which is, to me, this isn't bureaucratic process. It's just a way of structuring approach and thinking, which is like always start with a clear articulation of the problem. To me, that's not bureaucracy. That just ensures that we all have alignment on what it is that we're trying to solve and why it matters. And so that, to me, that's elemental, that's foundational. And no matter what you're doing, if you're writing a project brief or presenting at all hands or whatever, that universal structure should be reflected in what it is you do. And again, don't innovate on it because there's no point. Follow the universal structure and you'll be well served.
Amazing. Avrum, thank you so much for being on the Product to Product podcast today. Just to wind things down, where can listeners find you and connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Avrum, and I'm also on LinkedIn. So feel free to ping me on either platforms.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.